Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another original 62 book review. And for this video, we're going to be looking at book number 25, Attack of the Mutant. Now, Attack of the Mutant and I go way back to my childhood. This was a book that I read a ton of times as a kid, and I absolutely loved it. I never got to watch the episode until, my later middle school years. So when I was about 8 years old or so, I would go to my local library in front of my neighborhood. I've talked about this story a couple of times now, or many times, I should say, on the channel. But I can remember seeing this book at my library and always being fascinated by the cover of this. And I always wanted to reread the story because it involved comic books. When I was a kid, I was really into superheroes outside of my interest in horror, like Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark, or horror films for that matter. So this one always stood out to me in my memory bank within Goosebumps, at least in terms of books that I loved when I was a kid. However, when I got to my middle school years, I started to kind of see some problems with it. And I haven't read it in, at this point, like 15 plus years since the last time I read it. But rereading it this time, the first time as an adult, I have to say that this is one of those books, kind of like Bride of the Living Dummy or A Werewolf in the Living Room for me, that has not held up for nostalgia. But with that aside, do I recommend this Goosebumps book to you all? Yeah, ironically. Goosebumps rarely does comic book themes. I mean, in the world of R.L. Stine, you'll see some comic book influence in some stories for sure, but outright comic book themed stories in this series are kind of hard to come across. I think there's one GYG themed around it. I think the Dr. Maniac franchise in the moderns is the closest thing to this book. And then, of course, you have Attack of the Mutant. But this book was a cult favorite back in the day because it spawned a PC game that I also used to play a lot called Attack of the Mutant, the PC game. And it was made for Windows, put out by, I think it was DreamWorks and Scholastic, the same people who made Escape from Horrorland. And it made the masked mutant, the villain on the cover here, a Goosebumps villain icon, I should say. Or maybe like a cult favorite. And I've mentioned this in the past, and I still maintain this, after I read this, this past time, that I do think that the masked mutant can come back in a future installment. And I do find it insulting that he hasn't come back in a future book, because I think there's a lot of potential with this character that this book unfortunately didn't do much with, given the potential that was there. But like I said, I enjoyed this book. So if you are kind of curious about getting into Goosebumps, maybe you've never read an original 62 book, but you like superheroes, this is a great gateway for you to kind of see how Goosebumps tackles comic book horror. Or maybe if you're looking for a change up in your Monster of the Week stuff and you want something with a different vibe, this one does have that different vibe, I will say. It's not your typical Goosebumps book in any way. And it's one of the shorter ones at 117 pages, so this one does read rather quickly. And I can see why a lot of people love this just for the pace of it. So with that being said, let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story starts off with the main character, Skipper. And Skipper, I think, is a 12-year-old comic book aficionado. Well, I shouldn't say aficionado because he's not really a reader. He's more of a collector. And Skipper is talking to, I guess, his friend. Is not really his friend because the way he treats him throughout the story, but let's just say acquaintance, Wilson. And Wilson is a rubber stamp collector, but Skipper's a comic book collector. And in the beginning of the story, you kind of get a sense of their dynamic when Skipper's showing Wilson his comic book collection and showing him all these polybagged and comic-bagged comics that he has in this short box of a collection of his. And Skipper is saying that one day these comics are going to be worth millions of dollars. And right off the bat, R.L. Stine is definitely tapping into some commentary from the 90s that a lot of people probably forget was a thing, and that was comic book speculation. And that is a theme prevalent throughout this book, but I thought that was kind of funny to see as an adult that there are some nods to all the people who bought those million copied comics from the 90s from like Image and thought they were going to be worth millions of dollars one day. I thought that was funny, but nonetheless, Skipper's kind of delusional on that, and he buys into the jargon of the time with comic speculation. Well, when Wilson leaves, Skipper has an interaction with his younger sister after he checks the mail, and he reveals through his monologue that he mostly doesn't read comic books, even though he has comic stuff on his wall. Like he has a Jack Kirby Captain America poster, he has a Todd McFarlane Spawn poster, but the one comic he actually does read is called The Masked Mutant, and it's drawn and written by a guy named Jimmy Starenko, which is a play on Jim Steranko, the famous artist who worked on, Cosmic Marvel stuff. I can definitely see that R.L. Stine was working a love letter in here. But he's just a fan of how he's written and drawn, and he's looking at the current issue, and there's a league of superheroes called, I think, the League of Good Guys, and they're composed of 6 mutants, the same type of mutants that the anti-hero of the comic, the Masked Mutant, is kind of associated with, but he's the villain. And the Masked Mutant's whole thing is that he can contort his molecules and shapeshift into anything. And it starts off with a guy who's underwater, and the Masked Mutant's trying to go after him underwater, and we get to see what comes of that. Well, after he reads that issue, he has an interaction with his dad, who thinks that comics are silly stuff and kind of threatens him to destroy them and throw them away if he doesn't get to his homework. So Skipper rushes to his homework so he can finish the issue, and he does so and gets to finish the story like he wanted. Well, very soon after that, he runs into his friend Wilson at school. They're talking at lunch. They trade some tuna fish sandwiches, and Skipper is, trying to, talk comics with Wilson, but Wilson, all he can talk about is what he's into, which is rubber stamps. And it's just kind of bantery right in that point. But Skipper gets this idea one day to possibly go to this new comic shop, or this comic shop that he likes to go buy new comics at, I should say, where he has to take a bus, when he gets another issue of The Masked Mutant, and it shows like this cool little lair and all that, and he gets him pumped up to want to get some more comics to speculate on. So he hops on the bus, but unfortunately for him, it turns into a very weird scenario. When he's on the bus, he bumps into this girl named Libby, who he's never met before, and she lives on this side of the town that he's happening to be on. And she reveals that she's a fan of Archie and Jughead, basically, but it's not called that here. It's called like High School Harry and something else, which is obviously a play on the Archie comics. And Skipper's telling her how lame that is and all that, and he's like, I'm into superhero stuff. And when he's talking about that, he notices when he looks out the bus that there's a building that looks exactly like what he saw on the panel of his comic just beforehand. So he freaks out, and once the bus comes to a stop, he gets out to go check out this building. And Libby, since I guess she finds Skipper to be a friend, she gets out with him to go check the building out. And Skipper's like, wow, I can't believe that this building is real. And he's like pretty much culture shocked. But then the building disappears out of nowhere. And he's like, where did it go? And Libby's like, I don't know, whatever. And Skipper, they get on the bus and they head back, wherever they're going to go. And then Skipper ends up at his house later, and he looks at the comic and double checks that, hey, this is the building. So he's going to go back soon to investigate this building and see possibly what happened to it. So later on, when he goes to do that, he realizes that the building might be under an invisibility cloak, because he gets another comic in the mail, which showcases the Masked Mutant kind of in his lair, and there's a cloak around the building, and presumably the leader of this, the League of Good Guys, a group called the Galloping Gazelle, is going to the lair, and let's just say something happens, right? So Skipper kind of learns this information and realizes that maybe this building is actually real, but it's under the cloak, so he's going to go back there and peel back the cloak. So he gets on the bus again. He, of course, runs into Libby, and he's telling Libby that, hey, the building was here yesterday, you remember, or the other day? And she's like, yeah, but he's like, it's under in a cloak, and I'm going to show you. So he pulls up the cloak and shows Libby that the building exists, and Libby's like, oh, okay, and they go inside. It's completely empty. There's nobody in there. They find this bank of elevators. They try to go up, up to the top, but when they push the button, they pretty much crash land to the bottom. And when that happens, this freaks the kids out, and they end up in this area that is kind of unexplored, and they get separated from each other. And let's just say Skipper, he goes around looking for Libby, and he finds this room of sorts with these drawings inside of it. And he's looking at the original art, and he's like mesmerized by the artist, and he sees a printing press, and he's like, oh wow, the comic must be printed in this building. This is really cool. But as he's looking through the art, he starts to see that he is in the art itself, and it starts to freak him out a little bit. He goes, wait, that looks a lot like me in the scenario I'm going through. And he gets jump scared by Libby, who says, hey, it's time that we leave. And he's like, maybe that's a good idea. So they find a way out, and they bid farewell. And then when Skipper gets home, he realizes that he has another comic waiting, but now inside the comic, he realizes that he's a comic book character in the newest issue. So he tries to tell his parents, and there's this whole scene, very John Waters-esque, where the dad is cutting up onions, and he's like, hey, Dad, look, I'm in a comic book. And Dad can't see because he's teary-eyed. Tries to show his mom. His mom's like, oh, yeah, that kid does look a little like you. And Skipper's like, well, screw y'all. Y'all don't care about my comic book passion anyway. I'm going to go check this out and figure out why I'm in this comic. So he goes back another time to the lair. But beforehand, there's more banter with Wilson, and Wilson's talking about how he gave up rubber stamp collecting because it took up too much of his time. But meanwhile, Skipper is still obsessed with comics. So he heads back to the lair, and let's just say this is where the climax starts to pick up. So he heads back in there, and he decides to go in the building again. I can't remember if Libby's with him at this point, but I think she comes in later because she's looking for him. But essentially, he ends up back in the building, remembers that if he pushes up, it's going to send him down. So he pushes the down button this time, and it sends him all the way up to the 46th floor to this black and white area. And through this, he may or may not interact with a real-life galloping gazelle who tells him, hey, thanks for coming to rescue me. What's your superpowers? We need all the power we can get to handle the masked mutant. And he's like, I don't have powers. And there's just banter with him and the galloping gazelle as they're trying to get through the building corridors and find a way, I guess, to the mutant's lair to figure out what he's trying to do. And they end up in this ornate-looking room, and the door shuts behind them, and this desk turns into the masked mutant, essentially. And the masked mutant is cornered the galloping gazelle and Skipper, and let's just say something happens to the galloping gazelle where he ends up fleeing the scene, and Skipper's kind of left there by himself. And his friend Libby comes to the rescue and brings this toy and says that, if this is actually a comic or based in a comic, these are comic rules, Skipper, so this toy's a weapon. And the masked mutant's laughing, and Libby does something to the mutant that, let's just say, does something to his body. Well, then there's a revelation with Libby and what exactly is going on. And Skipper, using that logic, has to find himself a way out of the situation, which he may or may not succeed at doing. But there's an event that happens, and I skimmed over it because it will spoil the twist. There's a certain thing within the mutant's lair that he comes across with the galloping gazelle that plays a huge factor into a realization that Skipper may have at the ending with the twist involving his existence, and let's just say that. But nonetheless, that's what you're going to expect out of the book, Attack of the Mutant. So let's start off with the positives of this book. I'm going to say this up front. This has to be one of the better paced Goosebumps books in terms of like how it's written. The chapters are pretty consistently short in this book. So you don't feel like you're spending too much time with exposition and all that. It's pretty much hit the ground running from the start. So the pace on this book is actually surprisingly good. I will say the theme of this book, I think, really does excel. In terms of like a comic book idea, I think in Goosebumps, at least, this is one of Stein's better ideas, where it's coming to kind of talk about 90s comic speculation. That's a underwoven theme in the story about how Skipper is kind of leading in blind faith with comics and letting that consume his hobby and his future motives with things. And that kind of plays into Skipper's character, where he is kind of a jerk to Wilson and to Libby because he's so stuck in his bro dude-ish ways because he's such a nerd at heart and he doesn't think to like what other people like. He's kind of self-centered. But I do think that kind of plays into his speculative side, and it kind of comes to also talk about being a poser, because Skipper, the only comic he ever reads is The Masked Mutant, and once he's finally put into, let's say, the comic book realm itself, he has to realize that all these heroes that he kind of idolizes, he really doesn't share any of the same qualities of, and he has to kind of indirectly face that, which I think is a cool thematic thing that the story has going for it. And I will say this, for a comic book themed story like this, it does have some rich things about it in terms of atmosphere, in parts, maybe not the best prose or prowess, whatever you want to call it, but there is some atmosphere here, and it does have these weird things that really do click, like the mutant's lair, and there's something about it that's actually played up kind of creepy, and you wouldn't think that for a comic book story, but some things that Skipper goes through in this book is kind of creepy, and there's some legitimate body horror involving the mutant. Whether we're talking about if that's his abilities or not, that's beyond the question. There's some pretty good things about this in terms of horror in this as well. And I will say this, this book does execute, I think, character interactions in that slice of life a little bit better than some other books that try to do this slice of life or day in the life type of story, because this book does hobble along with that, but at least the banter in the book sometimes was entertaining, and that kind of helped it. And I will say this, the final climax of this story, I think, was really fun. You had not only a twist involving the Galloping Gazelle, but you had a twist involving the character Libby. You had a twist involving what Skipper was going to do. And then, of course, you have the ending twist. This is one of the few books that have like 3 to 4 twists to it. And I think that that's kind of fun. And I don't think anything involving any of those twists were bad nonetheless. And pretty good direction. Even though it's very brief and sudden at the end, and it kind of ends up being a little too rushed through, I still enjoyed it. So, yeah, the final act, I think, overall, really saved this book for me. Now, getting into the negatives, there are a lot of, like, smaller-ish ones that really do add up. Like I already brought up with Skipper, Skipper's not the greatest character ever. He's not, like, the biggest jerk. He's more self-centered and doesn't really care about other people's interests, which is probably his biggest negative trait to him. But he isn't all that unrelatable either. So, like, he's in that, like, morally gray category. He's kind of like an anti-hero in Goosebumps, which is kind of fun to read. I kind of like it as a change-up, but if I'm being honest, there are some aspects to his character that do get annoying, so that's there. The second thing that I think is the biggest negative to this book, wholesale, is that while the pace is nice, in terms of, like, getting the wheels turning in the plot, a good 75 pages, or the first 75 pages of this book, y'all, is just repetitive banter between 3 specific characters. The main character, Skipper, Wilson, and Libby. Not only you have that endless banter going on, but it feels like we repeat similar scenes over and over and over again. Every time these characters interact, it takes up a chapter or 2 of them just bantering about the same stuff they were bantering about before. There's a whole scene where when Skipper first goes to the mutant's lair, when he goes back the second time, he finally goes to Libby's house to hang out, but she has Archie comics, and then he complains about that, and then it just ties back to their first interaction where he was complaining about her interest in that stuff. And it's stuff like that just really adds on to I don't know how to put this. It's kind of mediocre in terms of like storytelling, or getting the plot to move where the story wants to go. The third negative here, and then this is more of a medium thing, along with that second one here, is that the book, it has this cool idea about, kind of getting wrapped up in what you love, and what you love ends up turning on you and all of that. And the story tries to play more into that mind gaminess, where the mutant is more of a mind gamey villain. And while that stuff is cool, the banter itself gets in the way of getting to the good ideas the book has. So consider this a co-spot with that and a joint thing, but I really don't feel like the book spent enough time in areas it needed to because of that. And as a result, here's another negative. There is zero explanation. Zero explanation whatsoever about how this phenomenon is happening. How is Skipper seeing this comic book building appearing in his real life? Never explained. The creator of the comic, he's mentioned in the story. You would think that he would play a factor in a building that's supposedly printing out comics and sending them to the real world. But no, you never see anything in this character. We never get any actual reason why the comics are coming to life or have been alive. It's just there in the story, and you kind of just have to roll with it. And there is a thing near the end that kind of clears up whether these superheroes are actually real or not. But even if that was the case, if they were real, why are they only being talked about in a comic book? It's just kind of bizarre there. Secret underground mutants, whatever, I don't know. And how that plays into the reality stuff, where if they're in the building, I guess they play by comic rules and they can just shapeshift into whatever, what I guess. But there is some technology that kind of hints that you have to be under that technology to get it applied. So that is a little bit cleared up by the end, but still, none of it really makes all that much sense. And there's a bunch of things going on that become logic hurdles in the story, and it really does set it back. And one last negative I can throw at the book here, wholesale, is that what I want out of this book, I feel like I'm never going to get. As an adult, I kind of look for things differently than I did as a kid. As a kid, I loved this book because it talked about heroes. And if you look at the superficiality of it, superheroes in a lot of comics, if you look at individual stories, they're not the most special things ever. And that kind of applies to this. But the thing about the Masked Mutant is he's a 90s comic book character. So, of course, he fits into that 90s comic gimmick and all that. But what I think what this book should have been, and I brought it up earlier, there's some underlying themes about speculation and 90s comic culture. That should have been more woven into the story. I feel like the Masked Mutant, the biggest missed opportunity with this character is the fact that he's a 90s superhero. The fact that nobody's ever going to care about him in the years. And you have all this setup with Skipper saying that he's going to make millions of dollars in like 20 years and he's going to pay his retirement and all that. But he should have this realization that, wow, the mutant is actually just some 90s Garbo character, and you can defeat him. So why not deal with him there? He should have looked to the more classic characters instead of trying to create all of this random stuff with the League of the Mutants and whatnot, the good guys, Galloping Gazelle. We only get to meet 1 out of the 6 characters too. I mean, like, there's missed opportunities tying the themes to those characters, but also there's underutilization of the characters, and it doesn't feel as big as it could have been. This book was only 117 pages. Honestly, this is a book that I think would have benefited for maybe 20 more pages of just explanation, more characters being involved, and tying themes together better. And I think if it had that, this book could have been a big hitting one, possibly pushing an A tier. But given as it is, I think this one kind of falls near that average territory, to be honest. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, I knew after I read this it wasn't getting a 4 or higher, so it was getting less than a 4, but I decided to settle on a C tier because I do enjoy a lot about it. There is something about it that is still endearing and charming, even though I don't think it's the best written Goosebumps book ever. It's still kind of iconic. And The Masked Mutant, like I said, he deserved a sequel. There's a lot of room to work with this character. There's a lot of ideas you can do, especially in the modern days, for him being a 90s superhero, to kind of make it relevant and make it like a mild commentary about. So, with that being said, I do think that a book like this deserved a sequel more than the Monster Blood books or anything like that. So, I'd probably give this book, with all the negatives I mentioned, maybe like a 3.8 out of 5 stars. I deducted 1.2 off collectively. Those two big medium ones were there, and the smallerish ones did add up collectively. But I think I'm being more than fair on this book. This is a high C, pushing just a standard good. It's a good Goosebumps book, but nothing more, nothing less. This is not the most special thing ever, but it will itch a scratch if you're looking for it. So that's all I have to say about it. It might hit higher for you, it might hit lower. That's totally understandable, but that's just how I feel. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Attack of the Mutants book. Let me know down in the comment section, do you love this book? Do you hate this book? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.